So we're going to turn now to our final round. Linda Yang. Linda is a second-year undergraduate student reading economics at Emmanuel College. She won the right to speak through open audition. Linda, the floor is yours.
Mic working? Is it working? Cool. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. President. It's indeed my honor to speak here tonight. And before I start, I'd like to make the confession that I actually auditioned for the opposition side of the debate tonight, and turned out didn't get the spot. Which might imply that Michael is a better speaker than I am. So I woke up this morning knowing that I'm going to make a case for the proposition. And I look at the case studies in countries that I've looked at in the past 1 week, highlighting the hypocrisies, failures, inconsistencies of Western interventions in these countries, and think to myself how I'm going to make a case for the proposition. But yes, nevertheless, I'm going to try. So to start us off, I'd like to go back to where Western intervention starts. After the Cold War, a loose consensus grew in Western capitals around the idea of humanitarian interventions. Tony Blair, speaking in Chicago in 1999, revived the concept of the just war. In a globalized, interconnected world, he argued, nations should abandon the outdated principle of non-interference. Combining self-interest and moral purpose, they had a duty to defend and uphold universal values, including human rights. In the backdrop to the Blair Doctrine was, as Laura has mentioned in her speech, was the crisis of Kosovo and the Rwanda genocide. In both cases, it is commonly believed that millions of lives could have been saved if the West has intervened in some forms. After Kosovo, there has been relatively benign international interventions in East Timor and Sierra Leone, and there are cases of intervention in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and also, most recently, Ukraine. The failures and successes of these interventions are mixed, and in the speech, I will examine them respectively and argue that, in most cases, Western interventions has been carried out with good intentions and achieved commendable outcomes. And in cases when undesirable outcomes has occurred, it can be attributed to the failures of implementation and establishment of long-term strategic goals. While the opposition has tonight attempted, the case can be made about the ineffectiveness of Western intervention. It cannot challenge the core values and merits of the interventions. So the first merit of Western intervention is that it can be used as a potential tool to save lives. Justifying the case for humanitarian interventions. Yeah, yes, please. Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate that, but I don't know if you've been listening to what I've been saying. So like Western interventions, there are many cases that the West has intervened in many different countries under drastically different circumstances, and Iraq is definitely one of the cases that Western interventions hasn't been turned out to be great, and I fully acknowledge the fact that lives has been lost, and there's severe casualties, and the West could have done a much better job in the case of Iraq. But also, what tonight's debate, as like both the proposition and opposition sides, we're highlighting cases of Western interventions, there are cases when it has been good, and there are cases when it hasn't been carrying out that good. So I think the burden of our side is to prove that in general, as we weigh all of these cases that West has intervened in these countries, like in general, has the Western intervention bring more good than harm? This is the burden of proof for the proposition, and I'm trying to do that in my following speech. Okay. So also, where am I? Okay. The Australian-led intervention force for East Timor in 1999 stopped their civil war and allowed for a transition to a peaceful government. Similarly, Operation Barras 2000 saw British troops violence in many countries. And Gaddafi's march in Benghazi hasn't been stopped by White House, led by Obama in 2011. It will have the potential to lead to mass killings in Libya. So intervention, when conducted well, can and does save lives. In a world of increasing violence, it is ever important to remember that. No, thank you. So the second merit of Western intervention is that it prevents the rise of sphere of influence of other superpowers, like Russia. This is the case for Syria. The lack of coherent Western policies on the country left the door open for Russia to exercise control instead. Russia's interests and values are in many ways opposed to the West. And take also the case of Ukraine. Ukraine and its international support have succeeded in preventing an outright Russian victory, imposing severe and continuing cost on Russia, ranging from high casualties to financial sanctions. Whatever happened, the nation has solidified Ukraine as a nation that it's independent and Western orientated, and I think that is what we are hoping to see. And lastly, there's the argument for security. If the Clinton government didn't declare the war on terror, there wouldn't have been more rampant expansion of Islamic extremist groups such as the ISIS and Al-Qaeda. The extension of such group not only undermines the stability of states they inhibit, and also threaten the rights of women, children, and minority groups. It also poses security threat to the rest of the world. Yeah.
Isn't the ISIS example quite a bad one? People generally agree that ISIS was able to come out of Syria and in particular Iraq because of the power vacuum following the invasion. If you say that, we did an intervention and fixed ISIS, we had caused ISIS to be there, and 1 million people plus are dead between Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yeah. I think the case is that there has been debates around the American war on terror, and definitely there are cases, there have been stats that show that Islamic extremist group has actually increased since the war of terror, but the fact is that we don't really have counterfactual here, so we cannot really decide if the West didn't decide to intervene, what will be the outcome that we're seeing today. But definitely, given the crisis that the West has faced, was facing back then, I think it's definitely a wise decision for the West to intervene in the Middle East. Yeah. No, thank you. And also my last point. So my last point is that Yasmin mentioned about saying about human rights, and I would like to point out that one consequences of Iraq has been the refusal of politicians and public in the U.S. and Britain to back intervention in Syria. In Syria, each day, unnumbered innocents are killed. Tortured, raped, as it were before our eyes, yet our eyes are shut. If we're talking about human rights, aren't these the things that we're supposed to be talking about? Instead of arguing against Western intervention, also on a point that I think Michael raised, instead of arguing against Western intervention on the ground that the West has consistently ignored or misunderstood the unique cultural political system of the countries that have intervened in, we should be working on creating a system that has a meaningful consensus, establish criteria for Western interventions, such as we ask ourselves, does such actions have broad domestic international support? What exactly are its aim, and what are they realistic? Is it legal? Is it morally justified? How do we achieve it? Militarily or through other means. So the proposition I'm arguing for tonight, it's not saying that Western intervention historically and also recently has been completely flawless, but what I'm saying is that it has core merits and values that we shouldn't ditch. And also, Western intervention has been and should continue to be a force that should continue to be a force for good. And it is not the tool that we should be arguing against, but rather the way that we use this tool, which Western intervention, in this case, indeed has the potential to bring goodness and harmony to the rest of the world. With that in mind, so proud to propose.